And our next talk is called ONIGO, #ONIGO, an inclusive, global, accessible. So I see you got global in there, you added to the title, global, accessible, multimodal OER in French. And our speakers, Géraldine Blattner from Florida Atlantic University, Amanda DeLola from University of Minnesota, and Stéphanie Roulon, who is not with us, but she's from Portland State University. So I'll turn it over to ONIGO team.
Okay, thank you for this introduction, Carl. Today, thank you for coming to our talk, which is entitled ONIGO, which is basically the title of our OER textbook that we are currently finishing. And it's a first-year French textbook that will be available shortly. Basically, the outline of our presentation, first, we're going to talk a little bit about the method that we based our textbook on, which is Français Interactif, which Carl is very familiar with, as he was one of the developers of this OER from the University of Texas. Then we will look at the essential pedagogical concept that guided the development of our textbook ONIGO, which is based on a multi-literacy framework. It's also a textbook that is inclusive, that really try to represent different type of voices and students in general. And then we also are using the translanguaging concepts throughout the textbook. Then we will go through a series of representative activities from our textbook so that you get a better understanding of what we did and how each of the chapters function. And then we'll go through our conclusions and our timeline for our textbook. So first, as I mentioned, ONIGO was based on Français Interactif. So we really wanted to basically update this method in different ways. So we wanted to modernize concepts that were presented in the previous textbook. We wanted to modernize the references, the images, and the videos, which we all think are very important to keep our students engaged in learning French. We also wanted to introduce a more multimodal textual content throughout the curriculum. We wanted to offer a broader representation and diversity because often in, not in FI particularly, but in other textbooks that are currently available on the market, the focus is always on France and usually middle-class French people. And so we really wanted to bypass that traditional representation and be more inclusive. We also included a variety of digital media and social media and online translators. And again, Amanda is going to focus on this type of activities a little bit later. We wanted to develop authentic, scaffolded target language activities that offer comprehensible, meaningful, and purposeful input to our students. We also wanted to develop online resources for in-person and online teaching. The FI method does not really allow for online teaching, or it doesn't make it easy, let's say. So we wanted to make sure that our method offered access to multimodal teaching. And we also wanted to offer a method that is truly customizable to the need of the instructors and the students, because we all know that we're teaching in a variety of regions across the United States and the world. And so some of the elements or some of the cultural aspects that are presented may not be as relevant to some or to others. And then we wanted to introduce a more experiential pedagogical approach through multiliteracies. So again, I'm not going to extend too much of our presentation on this, but I just want to introduce a few key concepts. So the framework that we're using is multiliteracies. Basically, foreign language literacy is allowing the creation and interpretation of meaning through text and creating strategies for learning and look at language in contrast to the communicative language approach. So we thought that was a really essential skill that we wanted our students to develop through the learning of French. We also use a translanguaging concept, which is a gradual immersion method and a simultaneous support of metalinguistic development. So we do use the learner's first language and also use the second language to develop develops across chapters and raises the learner's critical language awareness. So we again are teaching in different regions, and some of our speakers speak other languages than English. So we wanted to include these aspects in the learning of French, because sometimes it's really facilitating learners to develop their understanding of French. And then finally, we really wanted to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So multiple social identities are represented throughout the textbook to give students awareness of different intersectionalities in the Francophone world and their positionality relative to them. So again, we wanted to stay away from the French-centric typical textbooks that are available on the market to present a more representative view of the Francophone world to our students. So a typical chapter in ONIGO is built as such. So we always have une table des matières. Then we have the objectives of the chapters, and we're not going to go in depth today about these. Then we have a section on vocabulary. We have a variety of activities in the chapters, and we will present quite a few today to help you understand the structure and the content of our textbook. And then we have sections that are called variation sociale that Amanda again is going to present a sample of. And we finish with a section that we call On finit sur une bonne note, in which the students are basically reviewing the elements of the chapters and assessing if they are able to use them and they've truly understood these concepts. So the first element that I'm going to talk about is the vocabulary. And again, the vocabulary is a simple section in any textbook, but even in our vocabulary, I wanted to highlight the fact that we do not focus on the typical French variation that have been presented in textbooks. So for the numbers, we do present the numbers from, I guess, somewhat of a Swiss perspective here, which is also a more simple perspective for English speakers. So the system is to just continue by 10. So for 70, you're going to say 70, and then we stipulate en France 70. For 80, 80, and then we stipulate en Belgique, in some region of Belgium, they use the word octante, and in France, 80, and so on. And then we literally provide the students with a small explanation of the system. So even through the vocabulary, we basically present a variety of a linguistic variety, basically, so that the students start understanding very quickly that the French language is not standard, and there's a lot of variation within the various speakers and the various continents where it's spoken.
In this particular case, we really wanted to let the regularity of the linguistic system take over so that we could show this is the actual system. In order to do that, you kind of have to put into the background the hegemony of France and the prestige variety. So we kind of enjoyed this ability to talk about linguistic systems and not talk about France.
Exactly. Thank you. All right. So another element that is closely linked to the vocabulary is the fact that we introduce registers. I believe I mentioned that this is a first-year textbook. So very earlier on in the linguistic development of our learners. So we do that in a way that is extremely contextualized. We really wanted to expose them to a variety of register, and especially the registre familier. And Amanda is just going to click on a test de personnalité. And I'm not going to go through the test de personnalité, which is actually a pretty fun activity that we've integrated in our chapter 4. But what I wanted to focus on here is on question 8 and 9. These are the type of ways where we introduce these familiar items such as vous squattez la salle de bain, and they have to answer the question, or le soir vous kiffez, what do you want to do, and so on. So these basically informal words are not listed in the vocabulary of the chapter, but they are basically used in different tasks where they are pertinently used in a context that is appropriate. And so they get exposed to a variety. And again, if they, decide to use these forms later on, they've been warned by our little stars as well that this is basically less formal and less standard forms, but they get exposed to it. And we really wanted to do that earlier on because we really, as teachers and linguists, we've basically throughout the years realized that our students are usually exposed to some kind of standard, and then they're very unable to identify register later on when we're expecting them to do so. So this is also one of the purpose of our textbook, and this is how it's done. Another element, which is a small element, but it's very important to us. At the end of the vocabulary list of each of the chapter, we have this small section where we put mon vocabulaire or my vocabulary, and all of the students are basically asked to provide a list that might be more pertinent to their life, to their reality, with which they can add to the thematic vocabulary of each of the chapters. So in chapters such as the family, for instance, where a lot of people have recomposed families, they may have to add a particular item that is relevant to them. Or maybe in the chapter where we deal with professions, we can never list all of the professions, and we always have these questions. So the students can actually list the particular profession that they want to do, that one of their parents is doing, and so on, and have it as part of their vocabulary for this chapter. All right, so now we're going to move on to the activities and sample activities of the chapter. So the first one that I'm going to cover is entitled, we have these sections called On s'évade, and basically these sections are what we call cultural discoveries. And basically they focus on different countries that are based on different continents. And it's really elements that we wanted to use to, again, show the students that the Francophone world is massive, is extremely interesting and exciting. And this particular chapter, this activity comes from chapter 7, which is thematically focusing on celebrations. So we decided to do a little activity on voodoo, which is huge in Benin. And I'm not going to go through the different questions that we asked the students, because here the point is just to show you that we've tried to incorporate, again, exposure to some African Francophone countries. We have On s'évade about le mariage gay en Suisse, when they had to vote to approve it or to disapprove of it. We have On s'évade about spending vacation in Martinique. We have others about the food in Morocco. So we really try to be very inclusive in these sections. And these activities are always really engaging. There's often a videos linked to them. And the students have to do not only cultural reflection, but also we reiterate the vocabulary of the chapter, we reiterate the grammar points of the chapters and so on. So it's very, very contextualized all the time. And we're very proud of this aspect of our textbook. So I'm going to let Amanda continue. She's going to continue showing you a variety of activities from the textbook.
Thanks, Gégé. Okay, so the next category I'm going to talk to you about in the activity section is called On va plus loin, social media Frenches. This is one that we hold near and dear because we do a lot of research on our social media initiatives here. So this particular activity that we'll talk about today is affectionately known as La Phonétique Talk, which is a blend of phonétique and TikTok on everyone's lips these days. You may or may not be familiar with the subgenre of TikTok that involves homophones, where people use the translate function to come up with a bunch of words that sound the same in another language. Often it's French. And then they put together these wacky sentences and sort of end up articulating them. So I'll give you an example here of one of these. And I think I've shared the sound, so you should be able to hear it. I'm sure you've seen these before.
Mo, tuna, uncle,
So you see where this is going, right? She's got a bunch of things that all sound like the same syllable, which is ton. And now this particular user has taken the translation of those words and configured them into a sentence in English that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that gives you a really exciting phonetic output in French. And I'll play this for you.
your uncle mows your tuna.
So there's a lot of sort of fun that can go into this. Keeping in mind this is a beginner's French class, so we're sort of using at first to sort of get students exposed to the idea that homophones are very well represented in French, and then there are lots of sort of funny things that condense on each other. This sub-talk or this subgenre of TikTok is particularly interesting because the linguistic interaction doesn't stop here. What usually happens here is then the user riffs on this in some cultural way and introduces cultural elements or other things to sort of make fun of the pronunciation meme. And in this particular case, the user's into music.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Right, so you get the idea. We won't listen to a bunch of EDM, but basically she's taken this and she sort of sampled it over a dance beat. And so then there are other times people will put on costumes and they'll use backdrops from French movies or whatever. But they're sort of inflecting into it this cultural experience associated with using the language. So what we do at first, again, this is beginning French, so we don't assume students have much awareness of homophones in French at all, except for the ones that they maybe have come in contact with. And so we just ask students to watch a series of these TikToks, because there are many. We've just showed you a clip of one. And we ask them to sort of play around with it. Are the homophones always unique homophones? Like, do they sound exactly the same? Or in some cases, do the words sound similar, but they're not quite true homophones? We ask them to sort of listen and observe. We ask them if they recognize any of the words that appear in the TikToks. This is really important, the noticing function for learners at the beginner level. The next part is one where they get to sort of play around with the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the activity, which is often fun. We actually give them a series of homophones and we say, okay, you're gonna do this for yourself. Here's some ammunition. So you see we have the moi or moi collection, we have pain, be, la, and we say like, here's what these words mean. And we encourage them to sort of play around. This is cool because when you think about like sentence building and morphology in terms of how do you change the way verbs are conjugated, this sort of draws them into that in a very organic way that's fun, but that is also sort of for some greater, wackier cause. So we encourage them to write a sentence that sort of capitalizes on this, and then do the same thing. They put it into Translate in English, and then they get the French output. And then they sort of practice articulating it. A lot of our research looks at how the pronunciation of certain sounds changes over time. And so we've been able to sort of see the measurable gains that happen even when you do really funny interventions like this. And then ultimately what we do to sort of address the translanguaging principle, which Gigi mentioned, this idea of supporting simultaneous codes at the same time. We ask students to do this in English or to do this in their native language. And so this can yield some really cool results. And in some cases, it yields exposure to languages that other students in the class might not have, right? Because they might not be heritage speakers of a certain variety, or they might not be aware of how homophones are present in other languages. So that's the funny TikTok activity. I'll take you next to On Traduit, which is with online translators. We get a lot of pushback from French instructors about using online translators, and we do it on purpose. So we are of the mindset that these tools, yes, can be used inappropriately, misused, but our goal isn't to cover our eyes and pretend like they're not there. Our goal is to help learners be able to use them and teachers be able to help learners use them in ways that can give them access at a faster rate and in a different way to cultural content as they're acquiring the language. And so we have this activity called On Traduit with an online translator. Again, this is beginning French. And so what we like to do is use it to give students access to the kind of text that they couldn't analyze at this point. So it's a lot of it is poetic or literary language. In this particular activity, we have verses from a song that they've analyzed earlier in the chapter. And what we've done is we've actually gone ahead and put it through the online translator for them, keeping in mind that these translators get smarter every day. But we've sort of frozen it here in this mode because there are a couple of things that stand out. We ask students to juxtapose these two texts and to look at them in tandem of each other and to say, you know, what doesn't quite work, or what do you notice about the way things are translated? Is it the same word order? Is it the same kinds of languages? Are they using pronouns where you would expect them to, etc.? And it gives them in a very focused way the ability to access the content of a song or a poem or a text using this particular tool. The last one I'll take you through is called En prononce avec voice typing. So this actually utilizes the text-to-speech function, speech-to-text function that you have on Google Docs or in Google Translator. This is where you speak and it listens to your voice and then puts it into written language. This is basically where we give students little bits of language to try to practice that they would need in real life. So presenting themselves, introducing themselves to someone, ordering something from a restaurant, etc. And so what we do here is we give them small targeted texts and we say, okay, speak to your Google Translate. So what does the voice recognition function in Google Docs make of you articulating this paragraph? And it seems really straightforward, but what we found from our pilots is that it's not. And in a lot of ways, it really points students to the aspects of language that you can tell them about, things like prosody, things like articulations that are close together. And you can't really tell them until they see it fail for themselves, and then they think, oh, okay, this must be what I'm doing wrong. So it brings a level of linguistic awareness that's been really helpful. Unfortunately, it's also brought a level of awareness of linguistic bias. And so many voices are not recognized with the same level of facility. And that's forced us to have difficult conversations with our students about issues like race, ethnicity, bilingual, trilingualism, and why it is that the algorithm recognizes their classmates' speech, but doesn't recognize their own. So that's something we have been trying to support. These can be uncomfortable discussions, but they're really meaningful ones to have, particularly in this kind of context. The last thing I'll take you through here is another category. So we're moving out of les activités du chapitre, and we're moving now to the sort of stock categories in each chapter. This last one is one I love. I'm a sociolinguist, and so we talk a lot about social variation. We call this variation sociale. So the example that I'll give for you today is in our food chapter. And the variation sociale tend to be little subunits. They're often in English. And what they do is they point out some cultural variation, geographic variation, social variation, gender variation. And they explain it sort of from a simplified but linguistic standpoint. Here we talk about the notion of what le tacos means in France. So for those of you that aren't aware, the word taco obviously has been borrowed in many languages, and it has a particular meaning in Latin American countries. But the word tacos in France doesn't mean that at all. It's actually a savory meat sandwich that you often find served in a tortilla. And what we do is we explain this. We talk about how this is actually an icon. It's become an icon of the next generation of French youth, because we have a large representation here of immigrant populations, and this reflects many of their cultural heritage in terms of the kinds of food and the way in which it's celebrated. So we have a little reading. We ask students to go back to the main source, which is an article from the New Yorker. So that's in English, and it's there to support them. And then what we like to do is give an application activity. And so in this particular case, what we do is say, all right, well, you can read about it and you can have people tell you about it, but we want you to go find about it for yourself. And so we actually encourage them to go to Instagram and look up this concept. And so in this particular case, what I've done is I've done a hashtag search for Le Tacos de Paris. And there's a series of sort of small scaffolded questions that lead them through, what do you notice about the common themes in what you're seeing? And so you can see this is what tacos means in Paris. And you can see there are menus. In some cases, you get burgers, you have these flatbread sandwiches. In some cases, you have menus like tacos and dessert, etc. But it gives them this really vivid really personalized image of what this means. And this is out there in the world, right? So this isn't something that we have to necessarily bring to them. We show them how to find it. And this has been a really gratifying way for them to study these topics. So I'm going to wrap up. And we just want to say that, you know, ONIGO is a labor of love. We've all been working on this for a couple of years, and it's sort of coming together. Our goal here was really to make something that was free, open, and accessible for the high school set, but mostly we all work at universities. Recently, we have been in contact with the Florida Virtual School, which is K-12, and they previously had been using Français Interactif, and they're going to be using ONIGO. And so what we're really interested in doing is bringing this awareness, this new awareness of the Francophone world to people who want to have access to that. In many cases, it's students and teachers, and in some cases, it's autodidacts. We really wanted to do something that was inclusive and representative of what the Francophone world looks like now. We want to move away from these sort of static images of the way it used to be. Gégé mentioned this is really important. We're all coming off of this pandemic experience where we needed to teach in all the modes. And so we want this to be adaptable to hybrid teaching, to online classes, to face-to-face. We want to embrace the multimodality of it. We want this to be customizable in a short term, like 10 minutes before classes, update your links, add your own pictures. And we really wanted to emphasize this experiential approach. So our timeline is we're focus grouping it from here through the summer. We're piloting at various universities this fall. ONIGO will be available for public consumption in January 2024. We've had some people write to us. And we are actually working on the next year, second year French ONIGO Plus for the following year. We'd like to invite you, if you are a teacher of French, to pilot or review a chapter. If you're interested in knowing more, we would love to hear your input. This tool can only be as strong as the number of voices we incorporate into it. So consider this an open invitation if you are interested in knowing more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks to both our speakers. And now we have some time for a little bit of a Q&A. I'll just start things off. This was something that was mentioned in the chat. They noticed that you use a lot of links, obviously, so like YouTube videos. What do you do to keep a lot of these links are no longer active, or they may become dead links? What do you do in that case?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and that's sort of the reality of our lives now, right? So we envision that there will be a process of maintenance that will absolutely involve sort of going through and making sure that these links are still active. In a lot of cases, when we've been able to archive the dynamic media, so I'm thinking of like TikToks, or Instagram Reels, what we do is we archive it and then put it in our own space online so that we don't have to worry about those kinds of things. But yeah, ultimately we can't archive everything. So what we do is we monitor it closely and we seek to replace when possible. But we also try to link to places that tend to have regular, we'll say presence, so things like TV5, things like news databases, like téléjournal databases. They tend to be more heavily monitored than YouTube. But yeah, that's a great point.
And when it's text, sometimes we actually PDF them and incorporate it in the text itself. So yeah, they're permanent text, if you wish.
So if the website goes under, we still have the content to cite.
Right. There was a comment, let's see, somebody said that what they appreciated in what you were trying to do was that you didn't just have like a little capsule about linguistic variation or some kind of meta-linguistic topic, but that you were actually embedding it into the materials and into the activities themselves.
Yes, and so that was the main point, because I think we were getting, you know, I've been teaching for many years, and these little boxes in textbooks are great. They're full of information, but if they're not engaging and if they're not requesting a follow-up step of reflection or thinking about their language, and if they don't take it further, it's not something that is going to stick with the students. And so we really wanted to make this section not only just a factual section, but an engaging section.
Right. So I want to ask you a question then about just variation in general, because a lot of people in first year language teaching, they often say that variation is something that you should only do in later stages.
Yeah.
So they want us to do something
Yeah, we
international.
don't believe in that.
We categorically disagree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
Okay. So here's my question.
Mhm.
So variation for many language teachers is a Pandora's box. It goes on and on and on and on and on. So how do you strike some kind of balance? Are you teaching them just the concepts of like register or whatever the variation is?
I think the overall concept is to make them aware of register. We're not saying that they're going to remember and be able to use all these words and forms in the best shape and possible form and in the right context, but it's about exposure. It's about providing them with input, and it's about providing them with an input that is contextualized. Because if, again, these new words, or if we have a section about verlan, and they just read about it, but we have a section variation sociale, we talk about verlan, but then we have a song that uses verlan, and then they have to identify the verlan in the song, and then they have to create their own, verlan, and they have to reflect if something of a similar content exists in English or in Spanish or in the other languages and so on. So it really goes a step further, and it really makes them, think about it, because we want them to be linguistically aware and develop this awareness that, first year French, they're not going to be fluent. And I think the goal is not to just develop your linguistic ability, but to also reflect on your knowledge of English. And I think as educator, that's what we should be focusing on. And I think in many of these textbooks, this focus has been lost.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll ask a question about instructors, because variation is seen as often as a Pandora's box. There's too much variation out there, but sometimes it can be face threatening for, let's say, a TA who is a non-native speaker, or even if you come from one part of the Francophone world and you're talking about variation that you really don't know very much about. What would you say to those people who feel a little bit intimidated by broaching the subject of linguistic variation, because it makes language so much more dynamic, right?
So I'll start, Gigi, and you can intervene. Yeah, so we've tried a couple of things. I would say a couple of things. The first thing I would say is you speak a variety too. So don't think that you speak the standard norm. That doesn't exist. So what I think the point is, and I think that this is where people get overwhelmed, is that we introduce this concept of variation and you think, oh no, I have to teach all the things, all the variations, I have to be aware of them, but you don't. I mean, you bring your own sort of dialect or version, idiolect, whatever you want to call it, into the classroom or into the teaching situation. And so you bring your own areas of expertise with that. And so I think what we try to do is we have sort of a document in the teacher's guide where we explain these kinds of things for people who don't have any kind of background awareness, so we can say, look, this is what it's like. But we also encourage them to do what they can do well. So if you have had an experience in a part of the Francophone world where you could speak to a certain variety, by all means, this is probably the perfect context for that. So we give the larger lay of the land, but then we also say, ultimately, you are going to excel in the classroom by speaking from your own experiences. And we encourage you, rather than to normalize your French and normalize your own identity in the Francophone world, which is bogus, we encourage you to sort of use French authentically with your students and to not be afraid to show them, you know what, I don't know how they say this in Côte d'Ivoire, but there are ways for us to find this out. And, I can only speak from my experience in Strasbourg or your experience in Belgium, but that's okay. And they need to kind of understand that we are linguists and we are teachers, but we're not dictionaries and we're not encyclopedias of the world. We're trying to show to them that there are mechanisms and skill sets out there that we can teach them in a language class that they can use to find all this stuff out for themselves. So not necessarily seeing it as like something to overburden people or overwhelm them, but seeing it as a point of contact that you can personalize to show your students that language is inherently personal. There's really nothing beyond that.
And if I can add, again, we really wanted to emphasize the fact that it's customizable. And if there's a section that you really do not feel comfortable about, you don't have to present that. And I also think it's validating this variation. So going back to the numbers, that is a great example. You know, typically because I am Swiss, I would use the 70, 80, 90, but it's never been validated. It's never been printed in textbooks. So they kind of look at you awkwardly thinking, is she inventing things here or what's going on? As here we have the variation, and then you can do and use whatever you feel comfortable with. And so do the students. Right. Whatever system they prefer, they can use. And you know, as a Swiss, I keep joking when I go to France. Obviously, I'm totally capable of modifying my numbering system. However, you know, what's the worst insult that is going to emerge? Oh, are you Swiss?
Yes, right. Well, thank you all for this presentation. Thank you again, ONIGO team.